As you all know, we are approaching the 70th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. It's a good moment to reflect on its origins, its fate in these years since, and prospects for the future. Actually, I was about your age at the time of the founding of the United Nations, and my memories of those grim yet hopeful days are still very much alive. The ashes of the most horrible war in history were still smoldering. The sheer hideousness of the Nazi atrocities was just coming to be recognized fully, along with the realization that human genius had created the means for instant destruction of the species and had in fact employed those means to vaporize two Japanese cities. In those bitter and frightening days, the UN Charter and the founding of the United Nations provided a desperately needed ray of hope. It's worthwhile to recall the opening words of the Charter, establishing the United Nations. I'll quote it: "To save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom." The Charter is one of the foundations of modern international law. It was soon amplified a couple of years later by the Declaration of Human Rights, and over the years by numerous United Nations General Assembly conventions designed to, enabling conventions, they're called, to implement the principles and the rights that are enunciated in resolutions. There's further amplification in the judgments of the International Court of Justice, World Court, and other international tribunals, and by Security Council resolutions, which alone have the full force of law. The amalgam is an impressive body of doctrine, though it also has fundamental flaws. Those are recognized with some bitterness by most of the world, but often ignored by the powerful. The most serious flaw is a pretty obvious one. The body of law that is established is enforceable only against the weak. The powerful are mostly immune. That's a matter of great importance, particularly to people like us, to citizens of the United States, by far the most powerful and influential state in the international system, and also in many respects the most free of the states of the international system. That combination, which I'll come back to a number of times, is of great significance. The United Nations can operate only insofar as the great powers permit. That's obviously true for the 5 powers that have the veto right at the Security Council, who can exercise a veto, but there are, of course, many other forms of influence and control. The record of vetoes is quite instructive, worth thinking about. To understand the record, it's necessary to look at how power relations have evolved over the years. And what you find is that the veto very closely follows the course of distribution of power in the international system. in quite revealing ways. So a couple of words on the, too brief and schematic, but a few words on the evolution of power relations since 1945. In 1945, the United States was, of course, far and away the most powerful state in the world, in fact, in world history. Long before that, it had been the most wealthy state in the world, the greatest economy, and of course has unique advantages not duplicated anywhere else. In fact, by some measures, the American colonies, even before independence, were the richest part of the world. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had far surpassed other economies, even the combination of other great economies, and World War I greatly enhanced its relative power. The United States was, however, not a major international actor. It wasn't the leading actor in world affairs. Britain, though by then declining, still had that role, followed by France. Well, World War II changed all of that. Other industrial countries were severely damaged or destroyed. The U.S. economy boomed. Industrial production in the United States quadrupled. Wartime technologies laid the basis for rapid post-war growth. 1950s and the 1960s were the greatest growth period of modern economies, and relatively egalitarian growth. So the lowest quintile did about as well as the upper quintile. It's changed in the last generation pretty radically. The 50s and 60s are sometimes called by economists the golden age of capitalism. When the United Nations was formed in 1945, the U.S. literally had half of the world's wealth. Nothing like that in history. And it had overwhelming military predominance. The United States controlled the entire hemisphere. It controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of the oceans. That is unprecedented. And of course, the United States alone at the time had the ultimate weapon, the atom bomb. Well, considering the circumstances, no one with any familiarity with history would have doubted the outcome. Naturally, the U.S. would largely control the United Nations under those conditions, and in fact it did. And it's also no surprise that with the Cold War just beginning to heat up, that the United States used its power to employ the United Nations as a weapon against its superpower enemy, the Soviet Union. And one direct result was Russian vetoes. In fact, the Russians cast all of the vetoes in the early years of the United Nations. By the 1960s, the situation was changing. Other industrial powers were recovering from wartime devastation, and crucially, decolonization was underway. The imperial systems were collapsing. New states were arising in the former imperial domains, and they were beginning to become actors in the international system, diversifying power to an extent. The U.S. power was still incomparable, but it was declining. In fact, it began declining from the late 1940s. There's much talk these days about American decline, but it's often overlooked that the decline began in the late 40s and has continuing since, though the United States remains predominant without compare. So by 1970, the U.S. wealth was about 25% of the world total wealth, and still phenomenal quantity, but it's much less than 50% as it was in 1945. By 1970, the world was understood to be what was called tripolar, three major economic areas, industrial centers, US-based North America, German-based Europe, and Northeast Asia, which already was the most dynamic developing region of the world. It was then Japan-based, later came to include the advanced industrial economies of Japan's former colonies, Taiwan, South Korea, more recently China, and some of the Southeast Asian countries. The world was changing, and the United Nations was becoming more representative of the nations of the world. And that is reflected in the record of vetoes, which changed corresponding to the distribution of power. The United States cast its first veto ever in 1970. It joined Britain in vetoing a resolution that condemned the white racist state of Southern Rhodesia. Since that time, the United States has been far in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions, Britain second. Many of the U.S. vetoes have been in defense of Israel, where the U.S. stands virtually alone. In the General Assembly, where there is no veto, votes on Israel-Palestine issues are regularly passed by enormous majorities, something like maybe 150 to 3, with the United States opposed, sometimes joined by some Pacific Island dependency, other dependency. And much the same is true of the annual votes on the condemning the U.S. embargo against Cuba, passed similar, 180 to 2, United States and Israel. One of the reasons why the U.S. recently moved to a degree of normalization with Cuba is that the U.S. was simply becoming totally isolated in the world, and in fact isolated in the hemisphere, practically barred from hemispheric meetings because of this issue. Those are all quite important facts. And there are vetoes on many other issues. In fact, the United States even is alone in having vetoed a resolution at the Security Council, 2 resolutions in fact, calling on all states to observe international law. The resolutions didn't mention any country in particular, but it was understood that they were aimed at the United States, which had just rejected a World Court decision ordering the United States to terminate what was called its unlawful use of force, means international terrorism, against Nicaragua, and to pay substantial reparations. The U.S. responded by rejecting the decision, vetoing 2 Security Council resolutions calling on states to observe international law, and in fact escalating the attack. U.S. international isolation then was already quite significant and increasing, and that was understood in high places. There was an official explanation from the State Department as to why the United States rejected the World Court decision and vetoed the resolution. It was given by the State Department legal advisor, Abrams Affair, who pointed out, I'll quote him, that the world majority often opposes the United States on important international questions, so that we must reserve to ourselves the power to determine which matters fall essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States as determined by the United States. In this case, it was international terrorism that practically destroyed the targeted country. No other country in the world can take that position, even powerful ones. But that's part of the prerogative of power, that you can do that and that it remains almost unknown. Few people know about it. Well, this combination of power and disregard of public opinion is natural. Those 2 things go together. Power, disregard of other opinion are very natural partners. And they are revealed very dramatically dramatically when we consider the most serious international crime, the crime of aggression. Concept well defined in international law, General Assembly resolutions signed by the United States, others. It's understood, aggression is understood to be, I'll quote, the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains all of the evil that follows. Those are the words of the Nuremberg judgment, which sentenced Nazi war criminals to death and became a founding principle of modern international law. Well, there are clear cases of aggression in radical violation of the UN Charter, international law, global opinion, the cases where the aggression itself is the supreme international crime and the evil that followed is immense, right to the present moment. Actually, the most extreme case in this millennium is the U.S.-British invasion of Iraq in 2003. But there is no thought that the consequences are enormous. Aside from virtually destroying Iraq, it set in motion sectarian conflicts which had not previously existed, which are tearing Iraq to shreds and, in fact, tearing the region to shreds. ISIS is one extremely ugly consequence of this. But there's no thought of any punitive reaction, no comment on such an idea, no thought of it, and no official condemnation. It's impossible. The perpetrators are immune simply because they're too powerful, immune from any action or even verbal condemnation. There is criticism within elite circles, in fact, criticism of the aggression. The most extreme permissible criticism that you can find articulated is that the invasion failed. So President Obama is praised for being an early opponent of the war, but little attention is paid often to the basis for his opposition. He said it was a strategic blunder. That was the problem, which means that if it had succeeded, it would have been fine. That's the most extreme criticism that can be raised against a truly powerful state. Other crimes of state are treated pretty much the same way in articulate opinion. These practices are quite common among states of the world throughout history. The stance is commonly accepted within the violent state, but often not elsewhere. Part of the growing international isolation. Well, if you've been paying attention to U.S. discourse in recent years, you'll know that Iran has been described regularly as the greatest threat to world peace, standard phrase from government commentators. Actually, the world sees matters differently. The non-aligned movement, what's called the Global South, vigorously endorses Iran's nuclear programs. It accepts that they're aimed at developing nuclear power, though in fact it's not unlikely that they're aimed at least in gaining what's sometimes called nuclear capability, the capability to produce nuclear weapons, which is enjoyed by a great many countries which have far lesser need for deterrence than Iran does. And it's useful to remember that according to U.S. intelligence, if Iran is developing nuclear weapons, they don't know, but if it is, it would be part of their deterrence strategy. And no rational analyst thinks there's any possibility that they could use them or even threaten to use them. The country would be instantly vaporized. But the views of the non-aligned countries, the Global South, are simply which represent the large majority of the population of the world. But those are disregarded in the West. You can barely find a comment about them. You can search to check. And interestingly, also dismissed is international public opinion. It was regular polls. So a recent poll of international opinion by the Gallup organization asked which country in the world is the greatest threat to world peace. It was not Iran, which ranked rather low. It was the United States, far in the lead, followed far behind by Pakistan. It's a figure that was inflated by the Indian vote. But these fact views are not merely dismissed. The poll was not even reported in the United States. So the prerogatives of power dictate that it's irrelevant. Stance that may be convenient but is not wise. Well, it is of considerable interest that popular opinion in the United States diverges quite significantly from that of the decision-making classes and articulate opinion. So popular support for the United Nations remains very high. A considerable majority of the U.S. population has generally held that the United Nations and not the United States should take the lead in international conflicts. And a small majority even held that the United States should abandon the veto and follow international opinion if we don't approve of it. Such views are so remote from a lead opinion that they're barely even articulated publicly. And something similar is true of the General Assembly conventions designed to implement the provisions of international law. The U.S. actually ratifies very few of these, and those few are qualified by reservations which exclude the United States from their jurisdiction. Of course, the ratification by others is typically quite hypocritical, accompanied by no intent to live up to the fine words. But U.S. power and its increasing isolation in the world scene are illustrated symbolically by the fact that the United States assumes the right to be self-immunized from international law and does so quite publicly. Well, let's return to the most severe current threat, the atomic weapons. The scientists who created atomic weapons understood better than anyone that humans now face the prospect of self-annihilation, and they've often been in the lead in seeking to avert the catastrophe. They have a publication, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. It's a primary source of information on these issues. It has a famous doomsday clock, which was established in 1947, which estimates how close we are to the midnight of self-annihilation. A couple of weeks ago, the doomsday clock was advanced 2 minutes to 3 minutes to midnight. That's the closest it's been to midnight for 30 years, a moment to which I'll return. It's with such concerns in mind that the U.S. opens by declaring that all members shall refrain from the threat or use of force, with narrow exceptions. That's the most fundamental principle of international law. It's remarkable to see how commonly the principle is violated by the United States and lesser powers. In fact, if an extraterrestrial observer were watching what's happening on Earth, they would marvel at our inability to appreciate the risks that we're consciously taking. And they would realize that we've survived for 70 years literally by blind luck. If you take a look at the record, it's quite shocking, and I advise doing it. That not only includes foolhardy decisions, choices of political leaders, but also just accident. There have been a huge number of cases of very close calls where automated systems determined that a nuclear attack was taking place, and a nuclear response was stopped only by quick human intervention. The way the systems operate, there's very little time. Well, I mentioned that the give an example by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists just published a review of 6 years, 1977 to 1983. They found probably hundreds of such cases. And the article concludes that nuclear war is the black swan we can never see, except in that brief moment when it is killing us. We delay eliminating the risk at our own peril. Now's the time to address the threat, because now we're still alive, by luck. I'll finish by quoting I mentioned the doomsday clock. I said it had just been moved 2 minutes closer to midnight, closest it's been in 30 years, when there was a very serious war scare. Now, the reasons now go beyond the increasing threat of terminal nuclear war. If you look at the announcement in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, moving the clock, it reads as follows. It says, unchecked climate change, global nuclear weapons modernizations, outsized nuclear weapons arsenals pose extraordinary and undeniable threats to the continued existence of humanity, and world leaders have failed to act with the speed or on the scale required to protect citizens from potential catastrophe. These failures of political leadership endanger every person on Earth. The clock ticks now at 3 minutes to midnight because international leaders are failing to perform their most important duty, ensuring and preserving the health and vitality of human civilization. You'll notice that this declaration faults political leadership, not without reason, but leaders do not act in a vacuum. Even in highly authoritarian states, they're constrained by the public, and much more so to the extent that states are more free and democratic. And these considerations bring us right back home. Despite many abuses, the United States remains unusual among the states of the world in the freedom that citizens enjoy to speak and to act without fear of state violence and repression. And furthermore, the United States remains by far the most powerful state in the world, extraordinary advantages of security and health. And that combination of great power and great freedom provides unusual opportunity and also unusual responsibility for American citizens. More than any others in the world, we are in a position to act to bring the aspirations of the United Nations to fruition and to turn the doomsday clock back far from midnight.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. And now we would like to introduce our charity speaker. When veterans return home from war, adjusting back to civilian life presents many challenges. Veterans are forced to find a job and begin transitioning back to an average American lifestyle, often while coping with psychological difficulties. These struggles regularly put newly returned veterans in situations where finding stable housing is a daunting task. The New England Center for Homeless Veterans works tirelessly to combat this issue in our own community. They offer a training program that prepares veterans to tackle job searches, as well as a housing program that covers several tiers of need. Bosman 14 is proud to be raising money for this amazing charity throughout the duration of this conference. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Andrew McCauley, the organization's CEO and president, here today to speak to you more about the work his charity does.
Well, good evening, folks. I'm Andy McCauley, and I am here on behalf of the New England Center for Homeless Veterans. And I do want to take just a couple of minutes of your time to express our appreciation, my personal appreciation, and the appreciation of the veterans that we serve for the support that you're providing to the center and to the veterans we serve. So thank you very much. Also, we are based in Boston, so I do want to welcome all the delegates who may have traveled from other locations here to this great location, and congratulations for coming here and participating in this very, very educational, and I think you will find enlightening forum. Model UN is obviously modeled after the United Nations, and the United Nations is certainly an institution, an international institution that was founded and is dedicated to the ideals of peaceful coexistence. And I think that it would be fair to say, and I'm certainly probably biased in that regard, that people who serve in the United States military, citizens who elect to join one of the four services of the United States, are in fact a very strong force for peace in our world. They defend our freedoms, but I think they, from a larger perspective, they are in fact a very strong and effective force for peace around the world. That was my experience in the 30 years that I served, and I think that does reflect in many ways the missions of the United Nations. So I think there is some synergy and some overlap there, and I guess that might be my perspective. But I want to tell you just a little bit about what the center does, and I don't want to take a lot of time because this is obviously not what the focus for this forum is. But people who serve in the military and then when they return to civilian life are considered veterans. They are veterans. They have raised their right hand and sworn to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And when they return to civilian life, they are a very, very important and strong component in our society and in our community. In the United States today, there are almost 22 million veterans, and they range in age from the early 20s all the way up into their 90s and to 100. It is a very important, but it is actually a shrinking segment of our society. It represents just a little under 7% of our society of people who have served in the military. And veterans are very successful overall for a number of different reasons. People who serve in the military, I think, self-select to serve in the military, and they tend to be people like yourselves who reach outside themselves, people who want to be part of something important, people who want to be part of an important mission to bring good to the world. And I think as a result of that, they bring those qualities to their post-service careers and lives, and they generally are very successful. I also think that some of the characteristics, some of the skills, some of the qualities that they gain through their service, their ability to subordinate their own goals and needs and sometimes safety and health to the larger mission, I think also serves them well. And they do very well. They are overall more educated than the general population, and they are more affluent, and they actually do very well. But veterans are people, and people, as you know, throughout their lives, and as you experience that, you will see people just like nations and people all over the world experience complexities in their lives and challenges in their lives. And for veterans who experience challenges, sometimes when they're transitioning from their time in the service, following that, when they experience challenges and they're not able to be successful on their own, in the past, and unfortunately currently now, some of them find themselves facing that disruptive and disabling condition of homelessness. And homelessness is something that I have been able to gain an appreciation in the years that I've worked with the center, how disruptive and disabling that is. It does not reflect their quality, it does not reflect their dignity, it does not reflect their aspirations or their education or their intelligence, but it is a disabling condition. And the New England Center for Homeless Veterans' goal, in fact, is to end homelessness for every veteran who may experience it and be part of a larger national campaign, a state campaign, and a City of Boston campaign to make homelessness for veterans in this country something that is in the history books. Just like the United Nations goal is to make something where open conflict is something that's just in the history books. And I think we do that, as was described, through a series of services to veterans, social services, human services, where it's helping them gain housing, helping them gain the skills to be successful in employment, the skills to help them overcome the they may have. And they could be based on physical disabilities, they could be based on economic disabilities, they could be based on family estrangement, and many other factors that sometimes combine to force veterans, it's a small percentage, but an insignificant number of folks, to experience that homelessness. And any time of the year, but most acutely here, this time of year when the weather conditions in Boston and in many parts of the country are so severe, homelessness is something that no person who has served their country, we feel, should experience. Veterans are no more deserving than any other person, but we think they are especially deserving. And one of the advantages of having a campaign to end homelessness among veterans is to, in fact, come up with the broader templates of social services in our society, and maybe even around the world, so that homelessness overall for all the citizens of this country and the citizens of this world do not have to experience that also. So thank you very much for your support for the New England Center for Homeless Veterans and Julie.
I would now like to welcome back the Secretary General to make closing remarks.
So, before we close these ceremonies, I just want to take a moment and dedicate it to our Director General, Cody Smith. Cody Smith could no longer